Hey guys, today we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 5070 Ti in Doom: The Dark Ages. You can see all the specs for the card here in GPU-Z. It has 16 gigabytes of GDDR7 video memory. The version of the card that we have is the Asus TUF OC version. Over here in MSI Afterburner, you can see we're running on the latest NVIDIA drivers, running at stock with no overclock applied, pairing with a 9800X3D to eliminate any sort of CPU bottleneck, and 64 gigabytes of DDR5 memory. Let's hop in. All right, guys, we're starting off here at 1080p, and I'm actually only going to be testing two settings at 1080p because 5070 Ti is an incredibly powerful GPU. So first settings that we're going to be testing is just native using DLAA. And we're playing on max settings here, so Ultra Nightmare. Now, I did get some comments and replies on some of my older videos regarding Doom: The Dark Ages, and they're correct. And Digital Foundry has stated that the reason that there is such little difference between these presets right now is because the path tracing update will be added shortly after release, quote unquote. Is what IdTech said. So at this point, we're just going to go for Ultra Nightmare here. I know it's not much different than some of the higher settings, when we compare Ultra Nightmare to Ultra Nightmare, but we're going to just go max here at 1080p. And again, this is really just to show that, at 1080p, the card is pretty much overkill here. And this is using that DLAA. So this is that most expensive, form of anti-aliasing here. And we are obviously getting a high refresh rate experience here, averaging right around 140, now dipping into the 130s. So if you didn't care, about tweaking settings or anything like that, you don't really need to at 1080p with the 5070 Ti. The card is just powerful enough on its own that you can kind of just brute force it. And even in this little run that we're doing here, definitely a super strong experience here with 1% lows just down into like the 108, 107 range. So obviously a super strong performance here at 1080p. And, while the 5070 Ti I do think is definitely overkill for playing at 1080p, at least on this particular game, I did definitely just want to show it briefly here to just show, you don't even really need to worry too much. You can kind of just go full bore here, crank everything, play it native. Don't even need to introduce any sort of frame generation or upscaling or anything like that. And you are able to get a really solid experience here with a super flat frame time. And the only other setting that I'm going to test here at 1080p is just going with Benchmark King, his optimal setting. So he released a video a few days ago now and, went through and showed the minimal difference. I highly recommend watching the video. It's super detailed and really great if you're, interested in seeing some of the difference between the settings. So we're going to go for, max texture pool size and then his recommended settings here and see, can we tell difference in performance and can we tell difference in, and the image quality or the graphic quality. All right, so getting started right in the same area here. And as a reminder, that same run that we just did, we're getting right around 130 FPS. Now, I'm not really expecting the performance to be wildly, better, maybe 10 or so FPS, but what I'm also not expecting to be that different from my previous testing is, how good the game actually looks. So especially on a game like this that is, I love Benchmark King's videos. I think he, does a great job, puts a ton of work into them, and has really important and reliable results. So we'll go through our same little run here, kind of just clearing this room that is pretty intensive with all these enemies. And again, including that beginning area, which was a bit higher FPS, we are getting a slightly higher FPS. It's not like night and day difference. We're getting about, 5 FPS boost right now, looks like. Somewhere in there. 1% lows are also considerably better, so that is something to definitely keep in mind. But regardless of really the settings that you choose at 1080p, if you're running a 5070 Ti, you're going to have a great experience. It's hard to really tax the card too much at 1080p, that is. And as you can see, even with our very large cache of video memory that we're setting aside, we're still well under our 16 gigabytes of allowance. Not a huge surprise considering, it is the same amount of video memory even on the 5080. So definitely a really good experience here and essentially the same graphic quality with about a 5 FPS bump in our average through that same little run here. So at 1080p, you don't really need to be super picky. You honestly probably don't even need to really watch a video to have a good experience at 1080p if you're running on this GPU. Kind of just, will give you a good experience regardless. And you can obviously, play with some of those settings, inject some frame generation, inject DLSS, still get a really great experience and boost your FPS in those ways. So yeah, 1080p, definitely a super solid experience here. All right, now bumping up to 1440p, and we're going to start off at native, and still on, while I have them loaded in here, we're going to start off on those same benchmarking recommended optimal settings. And as you can see, we are still even at 1440p running at native, getting a real solid, high refresh rate experience, definitely above 60. Although our 1% lows are certainly lower now. It seems definitely that, the game, without the path tracing and some of those features, the settings, regardless of really what you turn on or off, they don't make a world of a difference, but bumping up the resolution, of course, does make some difference in the actual performance. So upscaling will definitely help you a lot if you're running into some issues or not getting quite the performance that you would want. So here, while we are getting, well above 60 plus FPS, the 5070 Ti is a super capable card. So I would like to be getting a bit higher here. And luckily, Doom is one of those games that, is highly touted by NVIDIA and has all the bells and whistles of, more modern releases with all the DLSS and upscaling, frame generation, all that sort of stuff. So although, I'm not like necessarily disappointed by 100 FPS here or a bit higher on the average here, I would personally prefer to introduce some upscaling and get a bit higher. So let's go ahead and do that. So just throwing on DLSS quality here. And now at DLSS quality, we are essentially looking at a native-like image. This by default uses preset K, which is the transformer model. So it's a super great looking picture, even with upscaling. Certainly quality upscaling, even balance or performance would still look really solid, but not really a major need to go down that far as our upscaling goes, because we are getting now a high refresh rate experience. Really anything like above 120, in my opinion, is what I'd consider to be high refresh rate, in that kind of realm. So definitely a super strong experience here, even in our most demanding area of this little run that we're doing. And as you can see, when we get outdoors here into a little less demanding of an area, now we're getting well above, that 120 FPS that was already very high. So, the 5070 Ti is an incredibly powerful card. I'd say for most people, this is like, as powerful of a GPU as you would need regardless of settings. We'll see how it performs when we get to 4K, but I'm expecting really strong results. Really, the problem with the 5070 Ti is not so much the card itself, it's just the fact that, it's advertised as a $750 GPU, and it's essentially impossible to find at $750, especially considering the fact that there is no Founders Edition, so there's not even a possibility of finding it at that MSRP. In fact, I don't even know if any of like the PNY or the cheaper ASUS versions, I don't know if any of those card makers are offering a $750 5070 Ti that has shown up on Newegg at all recently. So that's the main issue, but otherwise, you see we are getting definitely super strong performance here at 1440p. Really, so long as you kind of stick to recommended settings, you're going to get a strong experience here. Maybe introduce a bit of upscaling to get a higher refresh rate, but we'll see how it goes when we kind of just ignore those recommendations and crank everything. But I'm, like I said, I'm really still expecting super strong performance. So let's do just that and just crank everything. So we're still at 1440p here, and we're playing at native now using DLAA, and just cranked everything up to Ultra Nightmare. So max settings with that max texture pool size. All right, so starting off here, we'll go ahead and get going now. So these are kind of the settings. If you didn't really care, obviously most people who watch videos like this, I'd imagine you do care about getting, solid performance. But if you kind of just didn't care, you're just like, you know what, I spent $1,000 on my GPU, just turn everything to max. I have a 1440p display. I don't want to upscale. Everything at max, native quality. What could I get? And as we get started here, you see we are going down into the 80s, but still holding well above that 60 FPS. So, while you could definitely do this and still get, a good experience, a 60 plus FPS experience, especially on this game, and most games are not really like this, where, the settings, both are not really super noticeable and offer, relatively minimal actual visual upgrade. But in my opinion, you are kind of leaving some performance on the table, both due to the fact that, you are kind of enabling some settings that will affect your FPS and also not really, enhance your, your visual performance or your, your actual experience of playing the game at higher settings. But you could certainly do this, and as you can see, we're in the 80s pretty much all the time, and averaging out, finishing out that little room here, still with a 91 average. So certainly really, really strong here. So let's go ahead and we'll just throw on quality for now, which, quality again on this preset K, I think is like a no-brainer pretty much all the time, unless you're already getting like 150 FPS native, which obviously we're not here. There's really not a great reason to not turn on quality, especially when you have, a good baked in transformer model DLSS preset. You're really kind of just leaving that performance on the table for no, great reason. So here we are getting, a higher refresh rate experience, again, above that 120 FPS mark. So definitely a super, super strong experience here. And this is without any of the frame generation. So, if you're not really the type of person who likes kind of those fake frames, you certainly can play here, and you don't need to enable those fake frames and still get a really solid experience. But let's go ahead and see what the frame generation looks like here. So we're actually going to go full max here. We're going to do 4x frame generation while leaving it on quality. So we're not upscaling too much, but we are inserting a ton of fake frames. Now, because we are coming from such a high base FPS, it's still going to feel incredibly responsive, and it really does. And now we're getting 300 FPS, which is absurd and definitely way more than you would need in most instances, depending on your monitor and how much you can actually notice certain things. Way more than you would actually even be able to really notice. But you can see that number if you have a frame counter on. You can definitely see that number skyrocket into 300s and feel real great about that. So this is, in my opinion, one of the better use cases for frame generation, taking an already good experience with a high FPS and just kind of cranking it and populating a higher refresh rate screen. There are 360 hertz screens out there for sure. And, myself, I play on a 240 hertz screen. But to be honest, I have a tough time, telling the difference between like 170. I can probably tell the difference definitely between like 120 and 180. But between 180 and 240, that's where I kind of like, for me personally, that's where I kind of have a hard time starting to tell the difference. So you definitely can populate those higher refresh rate screens and still get a really good experience here with good visuals and really good response times. Honestly, really not feeling anything super noticeable or any visual artifacts or anything. So yeah, 1440p, you can play native, crank everything, still get 60 plus FPS. And if you're willing and okay with enabling some of those great features of, DLSS 4 and the 50 series cards, you can really enhance that experience and get much, much better here. All right, next up here, up to 4K, our last resolution that we're going to be testing at. Starting off with native, and we are back on those benchmark king settings. All right, so here I will be interested to see what kind of FPS we can get here at native quality. Mainly just because, in my opinion, this card kind of dips its toes into 4K range. Like when you consider it, is it a 4K card or not? Obviously, pretty much any modern GPU, it can fake its way into, performing at 4K. But in my opinion, a 4K card is a card that can hold 60 FPS at high settings. So if we get 60 FPS native, 4K high settings, in my opinion, that kind of makes it, pass as far as a 4K card. That's just kind of my personal definition. No real major scientific reasoning there, but so we kind of dig in here at these recommended settings. Of course, we are at native here, so yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to really get the pass for a 4K experience here. As you can see, we're dipping into the 40s, so definitely doesn't feel super great. Now, when you're dipping into the 30s in this game, that's when it really starts feeling pretty terrible. So it doesn't necessarily feel like terrible, in my opinion, but definitely doesn't feel as fluid as it would want, as I would want it to feel. Now, like I said, on these GPUs, if you have preset K, I don't think there's really a great reason to not introduce at least quality upscaling. So let's go ahead, we'll retain our same settings and turn on our quality upscaling. And now with quality upscaling, we are getting that 60 plus FPS experience here at our recommended, optimal settings, just using that quality upscaling. So, the upscaling in this game, in my opinion, actually across the board, even on, FSR, XeSS, every quality upscaling that I have tested looks great, and definitely DLSS looks the best, but in my opinion, it all looks really solid. So, so long as you are okay introducing a bit of upscaling, it can get a pass as a 4K GPU in this game. Definitely give you a real solid experience here, and we are now in that territory where, frame generation may not feel quite so bad. So while this is definitely a good experience, and if you were someone who was anti-frame generation or just didn't really like the feel of frame generation, you could certainly play like this. But like I said, especially on Doom, in Doom games, in my opinion, I want, higher FPS than this personally. So let's go ahead and throw on that frame generation. So let's go ahead and just throw on our max. Again, 4x frame generation. Now we are coming from a high FPS here, so it doesn't feel bad at all. Actually, still feels incredibly responsive, and now we are getting a very high refresh rate experience here. So you would be able to populate, a 4K, like the monitor I have, 240 hertz, 4K, and would be able to populate that here, and it is populating that and looks absolutely great. So you can get there just with a little bit of DLSS and a little bit of, or actually kind of a lot of it, I guess, of that frame generation. So definitely still feels like a good experience. Now, there's an argument to be made. I was watching WAN show a few weeks ago, and they made a funny case where, people complain about fake frames, but really even rasterized frames are technically, fake. So complaining about fake frames is kind of a funny concept in general, but, I don't really think, real frames, fake frames, it doesn't really matter. What really truly matters is the experience. So if it feels good, if it looks good, and if you're having fun playing it, that's what really matters. And honestly, this still feels and looks really great and is now like super fluid on this screen. Now we're not counting our FPS because the frame time average and our 1% lows, they're not super accurate when it comes to frame generation. So, but just looking at it, you can see we are getting right around 200 FPS, close to 240, I guess maybe closer to 220 most of the time. So definitely a super solid experience here, and this is with those recommended settings. So we'll try some other settings here at 4K, but in my opinion, regardless of the settings you choose, you definitely can get a real solid 4K experience here. 60 plus with no frame generation on these recommended settings, and frame generation launches you really firmly into a super high refresh rate experience with multi-frame generation. And let's just actually real quick see if let's say we didn't have multi-frame generation, if we only had the base frame generation available on the 40 series cards, and even with that 2x frame generation, we are still getting a high refresh rate experience here above 120 FPS. So you certainly are able to get a real solid experience here on these recommended settings. All right, the next setting that we're going to test here, still on 4K, of course, at DLSS quality, and now just using the Ultra preset. So maybe someone who kind of just, doesn't want to go through the trouble finding out the best settings, tuning everything, just says, give me Ultra settings, not the best, but really good settings, and, what kind of performance can I get? And looks like starting off here, we are getting a pretty high FPS here. I definitely think that we're going to be holding above 60 FPS, not quite into that into that higher refresh rate territory, not 120, but it looks like we'll have to see as we enter into that, main room. That's kind of our most demanding area, but it looks like we're going to be holding strong at 60 plus FPS here. And again, this is quality upscaling, everything on Ultra with that texture pool size still set to max. Doesn't look like it's any issue as far as our video memory goes as of now. And as we get started here, you do see we're not dipping below 60 FPS, actually not even really dipping below 70 FPS. So definitely a super strong experience here. And this is just kind of like maybe someone who just launches up the game, says give me 4K, okay, I'll throw on quality. I think this is actually pretty representative of how a lot of people might approach the game to start with. So getting here right around 70s looks like, and an 84 FPS average from our run to now. So definitely a super strong experience here, and pretty enjoyable, feels good. And just while we're here, let's see what Ultra Native looks like. So DLAA native here, 4K, and yeah, native will not give you a 60 FPS experience here on Ultra settings. Not a major surprise, but in my opinion, not really a reason to play it native. It really doesn't look much, if any, better than quality. In fact, a lot of times, quality can look better than native. Won't look better necessarily than native DLAA most of the time, but will look better than native like TAA a lot of the times with the sharpening. Definitely looks real good. So, yeah, native ultra quality 4K is not going to be a super great experience for you here at, dipping below 60 pretty consistently here with a 45 FPS average. Not super great. But let's actually go the other direction. Again, we do have preset K, which is that transformer model, which works really well in more aggressive upscaling. So let's throw on DLSS balanced. And, DLSS balance does get us into the 100s, it looks like now. So not quite that 120 FPS range, but yeah, definitely still a really strong experience here. 120 FPS at 4K is kind of a good target just because, there are a lot of TVs. I know there are certainly a lot of PC gamers who play on TVs, and there are a ton of TVs that support 120 hertz, and obviously that is the maximum for 4K 120 on HDMI 2.1. So definitely a really solid experience here, and really it does look a bit softer than quality, I will say, but it's not super noticeable. Still really great experience here. And last setting here, we're going back to native now and max settings. So Ultra Nightmare settings. Just if you just were like, hey, let's see what the card can do, 4K, max settings, native resolution, what kind of performance can you expect? And, we weren't getting 60 FPS all the time at Ultra settings, so obviously we're not going to be expecting that at Ultra Nightmare. And honestly, right now, this setting, I've come to find out, and, pretty evident that it's not really worth spending a ton of time on, just due to the fact that we don't have path tracing quite yet. I will revisit some of these GPUs, the 50 series for sure, and see how the path tracing looks and performs. But no surprise, we are getting below 60 FPS, and we haven't really entered our main area yet here. But let's go in here just to kind of see what kind of performance we can expect. And yeah, not a major surprise, but max settings, we're getting right around 45 FPS. So definitely not a super great experience, but not super different than Ultra, which is, again, due to the fact that those higher presets are mostly, seems like they're reserved for the, inclusion of the path tracing. So it'll be something that we do have to revisit in a future video potentially. But let's see what we could get here. How would we get a good experience here? So let's just go ahead and let's actually throw on balanced and 2x frame generation. So balanced with 2x frame generation still feels, pretty responsive. We're not injecting a ton of fake frames, so we're not getting like a major boost to our FPS, but it still feels, very responsive, and we are now populating that target that we've kind of loosely had here, that 120 FPS. So you certainly can do this, and again, these are even settings that would be available on 40 series cards. So 5070 Ti, you definitely can play at 4K, no questions about it. And really the compromises that you're making are not very severe. Image quality still looks great, and you are still getting, really good input response times. So not really a huge impact on the performance, or the, not the performance, but the experience. You're still getting a great experience here. And really, the 5070 Ti, I will say, I think it's the right GPU for most people when it comes to the actual performance, because you can really stretch the card pretty far without, making too many compromises. Just the problem with the 5070 Ti is the price. I will say it's probably the worst value card that I own. You can make the argument that a 5090 is worse value just due to how expensive it is, but really, at $1,000 for a 5070 Ti, you're much better trying. I know how hard it is, but you're much better trying to get a 5080 at MSRP. But again, the GPU market is just a mess, so even doing that is very, very difficult. But if you got a 5070 Ti for less than $1,000 like this one, you're going to be getting very, very similar, if not the same, or even potentially better performance. And I will say, you're definitely getting your money's worth in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, definitely a real solid experience here at 4K. All right, guys, that's been the 5070 Ti. Definitely a real strong performer here across the board. Definitely shines and gives you a real solid experience at 1440p. And with some of the DLSS, you can definitely stretch it up to 4K. So this will probably be my last Doom benchmark until that path tracing update. And then I may revisit it with the 5090, some higher level cards, and see how it performs and looks. But yeah, 5070 Ti, great card. This is a card that I tend to find myself leaving in my system after I benchmark a game, and I can use it, recreationally for myself and still have a really great experience. And definitely this game is no different. Certainly can play and have a great experience regardless of the resolution. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Take care. I'll see you guys in the next one.